I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my series into race and ethnicity in America. We're going to be on section 1.2 of my notes. That's page 7. In order to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF and use it to supplement your reading. And with that, let's begin with section 1.2. This is section 1.2. Okay, so three different sources of information that I'm pulling from. I've listed the three references above. And just to recap what we're doing in this section, in the last section we were looking at Cornel West's analysis of the three processes in history, the three historical processes that undergird conceptions of contemporary racism. And the three of them, to my recollection, let me see if I can pull it back, data. The first was the scientific revolution. The second was the Cartesian emphasis on subjectivity. And then the last was the classical revival with respect to an aesthetical account. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the contemporary application of those three categories in an attempt to understand the functioning of modern racism. So how does modern racism potentially manifest itself in terms of science? How does modern racism potentially manifest itself in terms of this emphasis on subjective identity? And finally, how does modern racism manifest itself in terms of an aesthetical appreciation that devalues other aesthetical appreciations? So we're going to look at those in section 1.2. We have quite a bit to do. So with that, let's begin. So race, access, and standardized testing. So what I want you to recognize is initially this discussion on standardized testing is the attempt to demonstrate how racism could, not necessarily does, but how racism could inform our standardized testing in terms of the objective criteria of standardized testing, in terms of the validity with which we believe standardized testing assesses. It's a keen assessment of ability within the population of people taking the tests, so that it has a very scientific tone to it, right? Standardized testing has a very scientific tone to it. But what I want to do in this analysis is to show why we ought to be very vigilant to make sure that our standardized tests, especially when you're talking about college exams, you're talking about any number of standardized tests that children take, K through 12, is to make sure that the standardized test is itself valid. It is constructed to do what it's purported to test for. It's actually testing for the thing that it's purported to test for. And that emphasis on cultural distinctiveness, emphasis on racial characteristics or experiences are left out of the test because that inherently discriminates against those who are taking the test who haven't had exposure or experience to some of these facets of life. So what I'm going to do is situate the discourse of modern racism within the potential that standardized testing has to propagate racist beliefs, right? Namely, that minorities aren't as smart as majorities and such. Okay, so race, access, and standardized testing. So standardized testing, what do I mean by this? This is standardized tests present students with identical tasks in environments that are, to the extent possible, uniform. Obviously, right? The environment is uniform. It's one and the same. You know, quiet, no talking, sit in your chair, use this type of pencil, no calculators, dot, dot, dot. You're going to have a proctor, right? So that it's uniform. Everybody's taking exactly the same test, with the hope that variation in test performance is unrelated to variations across test administrations and test administrators. So, pretty much clear, right? You want to have an unbiased examination where every student, no matter where the student is taking exactly the same test, answering exactly the same questions, and the testing environment in which the student is taking the test is uniform. Thus, any deviations, any variations in test outcomes relate directly to sort of practice and exposure and training and studying and ability of the student, him or herself. So, pretty basic. So Max Weber, that is, sociologist, says, this isn't Weber writing, this is somebody else writing about Weber. Weber writes, the patent of education came to replace ancestry, a manifestation of European independence discussed earlier. I'll explain this in a second. As a means of legitimate qualification for state office. So I'll read that again. Weber writes, the patent of education came to replace ancestry. So that you can imagine in terms of sort of the US and Europe, specifically Britain, B-R-I-T. In distinction between the United States and Britain, we recognize, I think there's another I, B-R-I-T-I. There was in the, prior to our independence, a monarchic rule, right? So that the monarch rule, the power of the monarch's rule was legitimized by divine right, and thus the monarch had undisputed power and control of state functionality. And the distinction between the US and Europe and Britain specifically is one of the means of accessing state power. In terms of, and Weber talks about this in other writings that he's done, in the United States, our approach is that basically anybody, relatively speaking, could be leader, provided you have excellent education and the proper charisma to match, right? Good charisma, good education, you're qualified. It isn't leadership by blood. It isn't leadership by lineage. And that's the main distinction, right? So that the emphasis on education then, and I really probably don't need to write a lot on the board, but the emphasis on education then is one in which the individual's attainment of sufficient education and advanced education allows him or her access to state office, right? So I'll read what Weber says again. Weber writes, the patent of education came to replace ancestry as a means of legitimate qualification for state office. Education in general, and exams in particular, serve to, quote, limit the supply of candidates for socially and economically advantageous positions and to monopolize them for holders of educational patents. So that the idea is education allows for a reduction in the total pool of applicants because we recognize that many applicants aren't going to have the educational qualifications needed to occupy said position. The benefit of gaining that education and having that educational background is that it allows you, it is the means with which opportunity is realized, right? You actualize this potential for an opportunity to do more and to have more powerful positions by educating yourself. So this is the narrative. Why is that better from the traditional narrative, the narrative wedded to Britain and much of Europe? Because the only way you could ever gain access is through direct lineage, and without direct lineage, no matter how much education you had, you would never find yourself in a position to rule. You would never find yourself in a position to make those decisions in terms of national interest. This is, according to Weber, the distinction, right? This educational patent opens the door of opportunity for leadership and the qualifications needed for state office. So the standardized test, and I'll return to that in a second, right? It's pretty much the same still, as I would argue it should be. The standardized testing movement has a racist history in both Europe and the United States. Standardized tests have been used to impede the social progress of Africans and African Americans for at least 2 centuries. So the question is, we need to recognize that if it's the case that this educational patent, according to Weber, right, if we're talking about, I'm going to use a phrase he uses, state office, qualification for state office, since the qualification for state office requires this educational patent, which is basically a degree, since in order to even be considered qualified, this is not to get the job, but since the qualification for a state office requires an educational patent, then you recognize that educational patent, earning this degree, attaining education, is important in meeting this qualification. However, part of the educational patent process, gaining education, completing your education, formalizing your education, in order to actually actualize this, is itself contingent on standardized testing. Thus, we can do the hypothetical syllogism and conclude that standardized testing influences our qualifications for state office, right? Indirectly via the educational patent. And this is to no surprise. If you want to hold very powerful leadership positions, it is important that you do well on your SAT. It's extremely important that you do well on your SAT. Why? Because your SAT will get you into an Ivy League school. Why is that important? Because the candidates that are selected to rule, and I'm talking now at sort of the presidential level, the candidates that are selected to rule have overwhelming representation. I don't think it's bad or good. I think it ought to be as it is. I'm not condemning this. I'll leave others to condemn it. And my own personal views don't really actually matter. So whether you think that the presidential candidates should or should not be selected from Ivy League universities is definitely open to debate. But we know as a matter of fact that a large segment, a significant segment of our elected presidents have Ivy League education. They would not have had Ivy League education were they not to have scored superbly well on standardized testing. Thus, standardized testing is important it's just another demonstration. Weber writes this, decades ago, but still it influences our understanding, right? This still influences our understanding of the importance that's placed on educational qualification in terms of state bureaucracy and rule. Okay, so the idea is if I wanted to exclude African Americans, for example, from qualifications for state office, the way that I would go about that, you're thinking maniacally, right? The way that I would go about excluding them for candidates' qualifications, if I wanted to exclude them as qualified candidates for state office, what I would do is I would make sure that they don't have an opportunity collectively to score well on standardized testing. Thus, the attempt to bias standardized testing, to construct standardized testing in such a way that African Americans and other minority groups can't perform well on tests, means that I have created a condition for delimiting their representation at the state level, at the national level, and so on. Alright, so again, that brings credence to the idea, just a little bit more depth to the idea that standardized testing movement has a racist history in Europe and the United States. Standardized tests have been used to impede social progress of African Americans for the last 2 centuries. So that should make sense now. The relationship between standardized testing and qualifications for leadership positions. So the bottom of page 7, we're going to talk about 5 potential conditions for bias in standardized tests. So the question now is to identify how we might bias standardized tests, insofar as we can discuss the mechanisms in which this test could potentially be biased. We recognize that it's going to make the type of educational degree that you have, it's going to vary. It's going to vary your pool, it's going to vary the possibility of places that you can go to get education, and you might not be able to get the type of education at the type of university you might desire in order to be considered qualified for state office. Now granted, this again, lots and lots of generalization, but I just want to create, and none of this I've written, I just want to create a condition in which you can understand, and you can critique this or you can defend this at your leisure. My role here is not to defend a position as much as it is to explain what's happened. So now what we're going to do is talk about so I'll move this. So we're going to talk about this now. So we're going to talk about 5 conditions in which standardized testing could be biased. So the first, The requisite knowledge of the white middle class experience is necessary for superior scores, argues Fleming, and I've listed above Fleming's citation, Jacqueline Fleming, so you could read affirmative action and standardized test scores in the Journal of Negro Education at your leisure, argue if you agree with her or not. So the first way in which we could bias the standardized test is that part of the test makes an assessment of the knowledge of white middle class experience. Right? So one way of biasing the test is to require one way of biasing the test is to require a knowledge of white middle class experience. And how might that unfold? It might talk about kinship relationships, mom, dad, uncle, brother, sister. You might not think that that's biased, but if you look at African American, and this isn't to generalize. I mean, and this is, you know, again, I'm just giving you an example. Whether you agree with this or not is irrelevant, because this is what Fleming is arguing for. I'm trying to give you an example as best as I can, but so it might come across a bit, even the example might come across a bit racist, but you can imagine that in impoverished environments, communities, overrepresented by African Americans, that the traditional nuclear family is probably not in place. I mean, there's any number of statistics that say, you know, the vast majority of children that are raised in impoverished black neighborhoods are raised by single mothers or in-laws or grandparents and such. So you can imagine that the kinship relationships might not be the same, right? How do you describe how do you identify the biological father for your half-brother, and the biological father has another child that comes over the household? I mean, it's stuff like that, right? So to talk about something in terms of, you can imagine a standardized test that talks about mom, dad, brother, sister, that might not seem like questions identified as such are themselves biased, but if you think about it, they are biased. They're not only just racially biased, potentially, but they're sexuality biased, right? Obviously, there are a growing number of students taking exams who don't live in traditional, quote-unquote, nuclear families where it's a mom and a dad. It might be a dad and a mom and what have you. So that the idea is just to evoke the example of, you can imagine that someone asks on some exam, you derive some question in which part of the assessment pertains to this traditional conception of the family. Whether you justify the traditional conception or not is irrelevant. What's at stake here is that those taking the tests, that is, those individuals who are sitting, all the students who are sitting to take the test, might not have access to the experience of a traditional family, and thus in formulating the test, those who write the test, those who are assessing the validity of the test, should have taken into account the bias that's presupposed in a question that evokes sort of nuclear family relationships, right? So that's just an example. Would I say that that would be enough of an example to sort of to topple the validity of a test? No, you need more and more complex, and there are any number. If you graduate with a Master's of Science in Education, I think you have to take as a requirement. I know my wife had to take it. You have to take a Statistical Validity class. It's on curriculum design and development, and you have to be able to know how to assess the validity of questions and blah, blah, blah. The idea is that is one way of biasing the test, based on experiences that you generalize and normativize, and thus presuppose that everyone who's taking the test has access to, or if they don't have access to, they should have had access to, and now they're going to be penalized for not having lived the experience, right? That's one hallmark way of biasing the test, and thus delegitimizing the validity in the end of the instrument itself. So that's bottom of page 7. We're going to flip over to page 8 and look at number 2. So another way, this is again from Fleming, historical and social prejudice, racism or educational disadvantage has played a role, and this is in the underperformance of minority students, right? So this is important, right? Historical social prejudice, racism, or educational disadvantage. It plays a role in test scores. The idea is that test scores are more than just the student's ability to reflect his or her capacity to perform. I think I turned out pretty well in life. I completed my PhD, I worked hard, I've published books, I've served on committees to hire other academics, I've reviewed other academics for their promotion, I've started journals, I've done free YouTube lectures, I've done all of this. But in high school, having been abandoned by my father when I was 13 years old, the eldest of 6 kids, Mom had 6 kids by 27, we lived impoverished the whole time I was growing up. It's difficult to sit down and comprehend how massively important this test is. It's complicated by the fact that you haven't eaten a full meal the day that you're sitting to take a test, which is complicated even more by the fact that your parents and those raising you, your guardians, don't fully understand how absolutely essential scoring on this test is in terms of your life outcome, and thus you sit to take the test on an empty stomach, having raised yourself for the last 5-6 years without any role models in your community emphasizing the importance of this test, not recognizing that how you're going to score is going to determine primarily, to a great degree, the entire course of your life, and thus you get a bad score. And you think to yourself, oh my goodness, that's it, I can't perform in college. But the truth of the matter is me as an individual, and this is a little bit of a deviation from the lecture, me as an individual, I recognize that no, it's about my drive, it's about my determination, it's about my willingness not to give up on my goals and my dreams and my beliefs. And irrespective of how well I did or did not do on any standardized test, and I've taken many, is the realization that at the end I am not going to deny myself an opportunity to represent my community, my life experience to others. But I do recognize how overwhelmingly difficult it is, because I was, as a young black kid taking the SAT, and as a young adult male taking the GRE, underprepared socially. Right? My community never informed me about the relevance of this test. I didn't have any opportunities to take pre-tests or to study for my tests or to, there was none of that there. And I lived in a fairly lower middle class environment for most of my life. Imagine if I were in, I guess I was middle class, the environment was middle class, I don't know how my mom pulled it off. But, on paper, we were dirt poor. 7 mouths to feed, and Mom was making like maybe $25K the whole time I was, with her as a kid. But I was able to go to just good enough schools to get to where I needed to go, and I'm here now. Imagine that I lived in the urban city, in an abandoned city, right, with no role models and parents there, and I don't have, as a consequence of living in that city, I don't have black or white, right, because there are impoverished white kids who live in these types of cities as well. But we know the majority of children who live in these cities are black and Hispanic. The idea is I don't have the educational opportunities that others have, because there isn't a surplus of tax dollars to facilitate me getting the new iPads and the iMacs, and there isn't the type of representation of Tier 1 great teachers, because the teachers who go to these communities don't particularly want to be there, right? With the exception of stuff like AmeriCorps. So shout out to the AmeriCorps people, you guys are doing amazing work in the world, right? The idea is the kid in this situation, I don't have the opportunity because I'm socially disadvantaged, because the social structures in place as a consequence of any number of things has excluded me from the fast track to political power, to leadership positions and such, right? So the historical social prejudice, racism, and educational disadvantage is nothing new. In terms of, so I'll put educational disadvantage. Read Kozel on this topic. Jonathan Kozel, he writes almost exclusively on educational segregation and the lack of opportunity for minority students in terms of their social mobility. Social mobility is built on, to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent, for the majority, social mobility is built on education. It's intimately tied. there will obviously be people who arrive at their fortunes and their wealth and their standard of living as a consequence of inheritance to a very small extent of the population, as a consequence of determination. There's a good percentage of the population, but the overwhelming portion of the population that is able to quote-unquote climb the social ladder is able to do so directly as a consequence of their education, right? They became the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers and the scientists and such, which afforded them the standard of living they needed in order to support themselves and their families, right? So it's very, very, I mean, there's nothing new telling you that education is important. I mean, that's why I'm here doing this day after day after day after day. Number 3. So you can see you can bias the test that way. Number 3, the testing situation is a microcosm of society. Now, this is critically important, right? And that anxieties related to issues of dominance and submission are activated among members of racial, ethnic minority groups during test taking. The idea is this test anxiety is there. You feel inferior. You feel incapable of performing at the level of others. In this lecture series, I think it has to be this lecture series because I'm winding down all my lectures. I think I talk about later this idea of, I thought I did, maybe it was in my ethnic lecture series, I'll have to go through and see it. But later I might talk about the idea of level Asian. So that yeah, I think maybe I deleted it or I don't know what happened. But there's this idea of Asian, and it just sounds, to even say it is sort of biased and in itself racist, right? But the idea is I'm performing against Asians and whites, right? And whites are even performing against Asians because they have tiger moms and tiger dads and all they do is study and play the piano. And of course this is ridiculous, right? But this is the narrative that's told socially in the United States in terms of our various ethnical and racial groups. In terms of competition, there are only so many positions for applicants, right? Universities get overwhelmingly more individuals than apply than they are allowed to accept into their programs. And thus, a lot of determination is going to boil down to their scores. So that scores are used as a means of justifying application. Now you can imagine that you're sitting there in a classroom and you're a minority student who already feels underprepared, and it's the day of the exam, and around you are, this sounds absolutely ridiculous and racist, but think about the test anxiety. The narrative says Asians are really good performers, whites are pretty good, but not maybe as good as Asians in terms of performance on standardized tests. And you're there as a black student, and you're surrounded by those who could potentially outcompete you, right? That test anxiety is a very real condition. It's a very real condition. One way to alleviate test anxiety, I would argue, is to make sure that children are always already in diverse classrooms, right? The diversity of the classroom is important. Why? Because students get accustomed to, oh, it's not just Asian over there, that's Mary, right? And I know her well, and I know her mom, and I know she's a good student, but I'm as good as she is, right? The idea is, when I came up, I can only speak for myself, things have changed since I came up. When I came, I ended up graduating from a local high school here, good high school, but it was tremendously underrepresented in terms of black students. I didn't go to a traditionally black high school. I went to an overwhelmingly white high school, and it was me and a handful of other black kids who went to the school. I was fortunate enough to go to the school because my mom worked hard enough to get us in a location that would warrant me going to that school. But I remember sitting down for, you know, basically all of high school, never fitting in, not being like the rest of the students, not really being accepted by other students, always being sort of the outlier, always being sort of in, not being accepted. So test days just made it worse, right? You can imagine the traditional anxiety that students have in terms of bullying and tension, not being able to fit in because of clothes and wealth and affluence, not being strong enough, not being the jock, not being the cheerleader. All of the traditional high school pressures now culminated in the test that's going to determine the future of your life. It's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure for a young mind. I don't care how old 18-year-old and 17-year-olds think, and I think maybe sometimes you take it at 16, but from 16 to 18, I don't care how well developed you think you are, because you can drive a car and because you're independent and you're about to go to school, you are nowhere near cognitively capable or ready enough. I think a lot of students, there are students who have been enculturated by their families and their communities to begin preparation for this test. I'm doing this with my children now, at this young age. Both of my children are still young, because I know and I recognize the tremendous importance placed on this test. But most people, it's another day, it's another test. You sit there, you're sweating bullets, time to take the test, and what do? You don't do well. If you don't do well on that exam, then things change, opportunities close, and that difficulty, that complexity, not to say that you can't get to your goals, because I was able to get to mine, but I'm here to tell you as well, it requires that much more effort then to be able to actualize it. You have to be that much more, you have to be built for it, for the stress, for the pressure, for the independent work, and you have to fortify your work ethic. Not to say that it's easier if you just get in, but if you just pass that test and you do really, really well, you'll be able to have a lot more opportunities than others. Is it right? Is it wrong? I'm not here to judge or assess. I think it's fair to an extent. I do believe it is fair. But I think it's the impetus and the importance of those in the community and the parents or the guardians of the child, especially minority children, to educate themselves about the importance of these standardized tests and to make sure that they develop a community or at least a familial environment where performance on test taking is essential to what it is to be part of that family. Like the family talks about education, the family discusses education at the table, at dinner, the family helps as best as possible to prepare the child for the exam. Why? Because anxiety, and anxiety can be huge, right? During test time, it really can be. All right, so 3A, biased, this is another quote, biased against historically disadvantaged groups and thus have the pernicious effects of reinforcing social advantage and disadvantage. Right? So it's biased against. Some of these standardized tests are biased against historically disadvantaged groups. The argument might be, again, very contentious. I think this is a good ground for debate. I don't know where I necessarily stand. I would be open to discussion on both sides. But in terms of SAT, you have vocabulary terms. And you look at some of the words that are on the vocabulary terms, and I recognize that you might just need to know, as a consequence of taking the exam, memorize some words and their definition for the exam. So we recognize that even if you become the Nobel laureate PhD, the likelihood that you're going to use these words that you're going to take on the SAT in your daily lives frequently, or even in your writing frequently, is very, very small, right? So it's not to say that the argument might be, oh, white people, these are the words that white people use. The truth of the matter is, I know a lot of white people, and I never hear any people talk like the SAT words that I've taken myself and seen myself and read myself. As I get older, I'm always adding to my lexicon. I'm always adding to my dictionary. I'm always picking up new words and incorporating new words in my language and in my writing. I think it's something we should just practice daily. So I run across maybe not a new word, but a word that I like the tone, it sounds good. I'm going to incorporate that word in something that I'm going to say this week, or I'm going to incorporate that word in something that I'm going to write in the next publication, just to familiarize myself with that word. But the truth of the matter is, in terms of the examination, I think it's wrong to say that it's biased because only white people talk like that, because I don't know white people who talk like that. And I talk to nothing but academics, right? We might talk jargon, but the SAT terms are words, and especially when you're talking about analogy and or not analogy, it's comparing and contrasting individual words. The majority of people don't use these words in their daily lives, right? Some of them do, but most people don't. On the other hand, I recognize that it's not fair to say that African Americans ought to know these terms irrespective of whether they use them or not, right? You have access to a dictionary. You should be able to look these words up, get an SAT prep book, read a ton of words, read their definitions. The truth of the matter is, increased vocabulary, the ability to speak articulately, and I've heard this my whole life. I've been called every name in the book, so nothing's new, right? Uncle Tom, okay, I've been there, done that. Oh, you talk white, okay, I've heard that my whole life. I've talked like this my entire life because I came from a Jamaican family, and my mom, when she came here, did not want me to speak Jamaican patois. She wanted me to speak American English, and she was absolutely adamant that I learn to speak English properly. And she was relentless. If I were to misspeak or to use the wrong word or use the wrong tense, she was always on me. Jason, no, correct yourself. This, that. It ended up benefiting me tremendously. In terms of the breadth of the terms I know a ridiculous amount of words. But the idea is I didn't understand these words, and I don't use these words because I read it in a dictionary. In terms of acquisition to vocabulary and increasing your vocabulary, it's always within the context of speech that you learn this. You have to use the words in order to really understand what the words are in the proper sense in which they ought to be used. If you just see the word on the on a sheet of paper and you try to sort of brute rote memorize a definition for the term, that's likely to increase the anxiety. Does it really go with this word? I don't remember. Is that definition for this word or for that word? It could be the other one. I forget. I'm not really sure. Paranoia sets in. Your anxiety sets in. Your inferiority complexes set in, and you bomb the test. What you need to do is you need to cultivate an environment, especially African Americans. Especially African Americans. You need to, and Hispanic Americans as well. You need to cultivate an environment in which you encourage your children and you encourage yourself. I do this. I have on my phone every time I'm listening to NPR, somebody says a new word. Okay, let me put that word down. Oh yeah, I did know that word, but I haven't used that word in forever. Let me write that word down. I read books. I don't know the word. I underline the word. I look it up. Okay, now I know. I'll give a perfect example. So I'll even show it. So I'm reading Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages. Super good book. Shout out to Brzezinski for being a monster. So I'm reading Brzezinski's book. I like that type of stuff, like, global politics, blah, blah, blah. It didn't take me a lot of time and when I read intensely. So it's like I'm really in the book, reading, taking notes, da, da, da. And I come across the word, this was probably about a year ago, I come across the word vitiate. So I'm like, vitiate. Of course, the first time I read it, and I'm a PhD now. Of course, the first time I read it, I mispronounced it. So I type it in. I wasn't familiar with the word, never seen it on an SAT, never seen it on a GRE, never heard it in my life before, never read it. First time I'm ever seeing this word ever. So I type it into an online dictionary that will pronounce the word. I hear it, vitiate, and they tell me what the word vitiate means. I go back, I reread the sentence in which it pops up, and I'm telling you the honest truth. I'm reading another book from another author some point in the future, and they use the term vitiate. And now I'm like, oh no, now I know what vitiate means. I'm not going to tell you what it means. You got to look it up and figure it out for yourself. But that's the idea. So don't think that, there's nothing to be ashamed of. I'm in no sense ashamed of the fact that I was well into my 30s before I figured out what friggin' vitiate means. But I live and I cultivate an appreciation of new terms and new words as a process of just my lifestyle. The way in which I live in the world is such that I'm always trying to make sense of new terms and new terminology. The problem, however, and this is going to come across bad, and I apologize beforehand. The problem, but I'm saying this as a member of the Black community, Black American community. The problem, however, with a lot of the Black American community is that rather than learning real words, Ebonics Ebonics dominates the discourse. So that, yeah, we can flip Ebonics terms, and I think there's power in that separately. And we recognize the interchange of new Ebonic words and terms that come in and out of the the urban lexicon. Okay, fine. But at the end of the day, you're not going to ever be tested on that. So my idea is, why spend the time cultivating this enormous catalog of Ebonics terms that you have when you're never going to be assessed on that? Now, if people want to argue about that, I think there's lots of rooms for argument with respect to the role of Ebonics in education. Personally speaking, I I'm not going to address what I personally believe because it's sort of obvious, right? I would not encourage that. I think in terms of Ebonics, it's something, a social practice that we need, and I believe we ought to cultivate it in terms of social practice, but I do not believe that it should be incorporated in terms of educational practice. I don't see the legitimacy for it, and I know a lot of black theorists disagree with me, but that we'll have to agree to disagree. The point of number 3, and why I'm spending so much time on this, is that part of this disadvantage, part of the reason why there's an underperformance within minority communities, especially the African American, Black American community, is that there isn't an appreciation of words. Right? You have to recognize, irrespective of math and science, right? Because I recognize there's math, not really so much science and standardized tests, but definitely math and English. The idea is you can already develop, maybe 2, 3, 4, 500 point increase in the possibility of your score just by having an appreciation for words, which for many is easier than understanding how to solve a mathematical problem, right? So that there is no reason to go into the test, a standardized test, and to be both bad in English and bad in math. If you're really, really good at math and you're bad in English, well, you offset your total score because you're so good at math. If you're really, really good in English and you're bad at math, then you offset your low score at math because you're good in English. The idea is to try and find dominance in at least one of them, right? Find dominance in either math or English, but find some dominance. If it's not going to be the case that you're going to be able to succeed and thrive in mathematics, take the time to cultivate an appreciation of language and terms, and that can potentially carry you through, right? It can carry you through. So it's expressly urgent that students and their caregivers pay attention to those facts. So 3B, because standardized tests reflect the majority culture, minority students' performance on them may not yield a fair representation of what these students really know and can do, given their economic and educational disadvantages. I mean, this is self-explanatory, right? We are more than our test scores, period. End of discussion. Black or white, Hispanic, Asian, Jew, Native American, we're more than our test scores. Just like you have the commercial, I think it's Special K has a cool commercial for the beginning of the year, and it just it didn't really impact me because I would never buy that product. It's not something for me, but I thought it was an interesting commercial. It just popped in my head immediately as a great example. It's like, it's the new year and everybody's on the diet fad, and this is going to last for a couple months. Everybody wants to get fit and lose weight, sign up for gym memberships and blah, blah, blah. This happens every single year in January in the United States of America. Since I was a kid, well after I'm dead. So the commercial is women of all different sizes and shapes and colors and ethnicities and race, they step on the scale. So you see all these feet stepping on scales. And you see the scale beginning the processing, and you're waiting for a number as the viewer. But you're never given the number in the commercial. What you get, which is really great, right? What you get is some praise, like you're beautiful, joy, be happy, you're not fat, stuff like that. It's very sort of reaffirming. It's very reaffirming. Why is that important? Because the women recognize that they are more than the number on the scale. It's not just that the scale says a number that I think is too fat, and I'm that thing, I'm that bad thing. No, I'm a human being, and I'm going to be happy because I'm making progress in my diet and such. Similarly, you look at your test scores, and the idea is, wow, I got a really bad score on my GRE, or I got a really bad score on my SAT, and you immediately want to internalize that bad score as, I'm not smart, I'm dumb, I'm never going to make it, I'm not cut out for academia, I'm not cut out for professorship or teaching or what have you. And the truth of the matter is, it's only one means of assessing a student's ability to perform well in college. It's only one means of assessing. There needs to be some, I agree, and I do believe that there needs to be some empirical assessment, because we're talking about the entire population of the United States of America. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of students that access and enter college yearly. I don't know, maybe it's not hundreds of thousands. It would be interesting to see nationally the national enrollment for freshmen in colleges and universities. It's maybe tens of thousands. It wouldn't surprise me if it was hundreds of thousands annually, though. You're talking about a lot of people, and those are just the people who get in. these aren't just these aren't the total of pool of people who are trying to get it. So you're talking about a lot of people. The idea is that score is a representation of your ability at that time, given the context of the examination. And as a minority student, or as even a majority, I'm not going to bias the lecture in that regard. As any student taking the test, you have to recognize that you are more than that score. So there's no surprise Bill Gates and Zuckerberg get into Ivy League colleges, they get the best scores, they go to the best schools, and what do they end up doing? They end up dropping out of school. Why? Because they recognize, listen, I'm already so far ahead of the curve, there's nothing I'm going to learn here, I need to get out of this environment because this environment is actually going to hold me back. So, different strokes for different folks, right? Some people will get the high scores, get into the big schools, and then leave because they recognize they don't need school. Some people will want to get into the big schools, not be able to score, not get into the big schools, but still become what they wanted to be, right? So that there's any number of possibilities for students of all kinds. One thing that we have to recognize, however, and I do agree with the author, is that African American and minority students are specifically disadvantaged because of primarily socioeconomics, and their social structures don't facilitate education as being important. I'm here to tell you, to be a nerd in the black community is not a good thing. To be a thug in the black community, pretty cool. To walk around with a backpack and thick glasses, you're going to get teased. To walk around with any different types of colors and bandanas and tattoos is cool. The idea is we socially need to cultivate an appreciation for education. And a lot of the first year and a half, maybe 2 years of my YouTube video was an attempt to put myself out there so that young students, if they ever come across my stuff, could be like, oh my goodness, he looks like me, but he talks like them. I want to be like him. Right? That was like the first year. I'm sort of beyond that now. But the economics is important. It's not just social, it's economic, it's socioeconomic. And the economics is important. If you don't eat, if you don't have access to breakfast, if you're living impoverished, if you're not getting enough sleep, if your family doesn't appreciate the importance of school because it's about paying the immediate bills, then you create a condition in which obviously students aren't going to perform as well because they don't have the means to perform as well. And that's what 3B says. So number 4, and I started writing this down and I stopped. Oh, that was 4. So 3 would be, 3 is not causal. Causal is part of educational disadvantage. 3 is a microcosm. 4, the correlation between SAT and GPA, known as predictive validity, is lower for black students than whites. And that's a fact, right? Predictive validity predictive validity pertains to the attempt to predict students' ability to achieve in college. I am definitely an outlier in many regards. I took my exams as best as I could. I didn't have the greatest scores because I didn't have an appreciation at that age for the importance of education. I didn't come from an environment, language was important and speech was important, but I'm the first person to get graduate education in my family. And a lot of my family is highly educated now, after the fact, after I went and sort of forged, sort of made the path. A lot of my brothers and sisters are very, very sort of accomplished. But the idea is, it was me initially, with no one helping me, with no one giving me any guidance as to what I ought to be doing in school, and thus I didn't initially perform as well as I would have liked to. But the truth of the matter, just like the Special K commercial, I recognized that I was better than my scores, that I have something in me that perpetually motivates me to do better for myself. Not just so that it's, not just so it's yay me. I take everything that I learn and I give it to other people. This is what I've been doing forever. And this is what I will continue to do as long as I'm alive, because it brings meaning to my life. The fact that I was underrepresented. I have a video where I was like, I forget which video it was. I've uploaded so many. But I talk about sort of test taking, and I'm not genetically super smart. Like, I'm not one of those guys irrespective of all the logic that I've learned, and irrespective of all the intuitive stuff that I've learned in the language and the semiotic stuff that I've learned, as a lived experience for myself, it's all a product of just determination and will. This stuff does not come naturally to me. It's not easy. It's very difficult. It's painstaking hours, days, years of constantly going back to the same source material, only to reinterpret it from a slightly more opened interpretation. Opened meaning the opportunity to understand more of the theorem, of the formula, of the rule of inference or what have you, and then it finally starts to click after a while. This is precisely why I need to do language acquisition either this year or next year, because I have to speak another language fluently before my time is up, right? That's the next goal for me, right? It's like I have to learn to speak another language, because I know it's not about brain power as much as it is about just putting in the hours to learn it, devoting yourself to it, and then reaping the benefits of new relationships and new friendships and access to new literature and new source material in original languages. So it's important. But in terms of predictive validity, it predicts, but it doesn't determine. And that's important, right? These tests make predictions, but they do not determine the course of an individual's life. It doesn't mean that if you score poorly on an exam that you'll never be successful, that you'll never make millions, that you'll never become the professor, that you'll never be able to give back to society. It does not mean that. It's merely only a prediction. The point is, however, that prediction is essentially important in getting you into a position of leadership, in getting you in a position to be a very, very powerful decision maker. It's undeniable. And I believe, people can disagree with me, I believe it is as it ought to be, right? I think it speaks to the rigor of those who are, and I recognize there are ways of biasing this, but I do, at least in theoretically, like a very selective process in which representation at the most selective levels require a tremendous amount of discomfort, right? You have to live a discomforted life. You have to study for many hours. You have to put in the work. You have to be able to perform at high levels, and then after you've proven and demonstrated yourself, then you get to sort of occupy that position. There's something romantic about that idea for me. I recognize it's probably not the case in many instances because of nepotism and lineage and all this other stuff, but just money, the power of capital. But I think in its purest sense, I do like the idea that anybody in the United States of America has the ability to assume the highest leadership position if he or she is willing to put in the time in education. That to me that's what America's all about, right? That's precisely why we're not a monarchic system, right? As Weber had said. And then lastly, number 5, the impact of mandated standardized testing on minority students cited by the growing number of researchers is its role in the denial of opportunities to minorities. The idea is that minorities are denied opportunity. They're denied access. They're denied representation because they are underprepared, right? And this under-preparation is systematic and structural. And I actually do believe this, right? No conspiracy theory, no boogeyman aside, it's just a fact. It's partly a social fact, and I think part of it has to do with just a socio-cultural community in which African Americans, not primarily, I wouldn't go that far, but impoverished urban identity is severely, and I mean severely attached to a very destitute mentality, very impoverished mentality. The glorification of thuggery, the glorification of strippers and money and lavish lifestyle and just that as norm. And it's enticing. I mean, here it is. Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Thanks for watching my videos. We're going to do 20 hours on this boring crap. Versus, here's a 2-minute video. You're going to see partially nude chicks. There's going to be money everywhere. There's going to be gold cars and rims and flash and diamonds everywhere. Make a choice. Who in their right mind would choose me over that? I can't compete with that. And there's no way I can compete with that. Education has a very difficult time competing with that. Education, this is why I believe, quick side note, this is why I believe that, pre-K education is so absolutely critical, because Sesame Street, Big Bird, Dora the Explorer can compete, because you're not going to expose your child. No well-formed, rational adult parent is going to necessarily expose their child, or directly, intentfully expose their child to those images. And so what do you want to expose your children to? Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch and Grover, and yeah, I think pre-K education is absolutely important. I think it's a shame what's been happening with PBS and educational opportunity. If we're going to talk about poverty, this week has been the War on Poverty speech, blah, blah, blah. It's been the 50th anniversary, but I think it's important to recognize that you can't discuss a war on poverty without recognizing the importance of primary education. The war on poverty begins with preschool education. I mean, call it what you want, but I think all students, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, you name it, need to have a very rigorous pre-K education, because it's at those early ages where students, especially with respect to stuff like logic, and I'm here to tell you because I've been cultivating this in my children as well. My son's able to do stuff that at his age there wouldn't even be a possibility that I can do some of the stuff that he's done. He's been solving puzzles his whole life because I've been training him and helping him. And my daughter too, she's a phenom. She's really good. She's actually better than him at math. They're both really, really good. Why? Because ever since they were little, it's been, hey, which one's bigger? And you do the flute glass experiment, where you take a glass and it's a very tall glass but very thin, and you take a short glass and it's very stout, and you ask the child at a very young age, maybe like 2, 3-ish, not too old, like maybe 3 years old, which one holds more water? Invariably the child always says it's the flute, right? Because it's longer and it's taller. And then what you do is you take the very stout short glass, you fill it up with water, and you pour it into the flute, and you recognize there's nothing really there, right? It's sort of vapid. It's all simulacra. That very, very basic, super simple experiment opens up your child's mind to recognize, like, wow, there's more to this world than just perception. That's super simple, like basic Science 101 experiment opens up your child's mind and gets them to think critically about the world, and maybe what I'm seeing isn't really what is. Maybe there's something more to it. Let me start to intuit what I might feel, and this is what science is built on, right? Science, and I mean science both in hard science and social science, is built on a recognition that there's more than meets the eye, right? There's more to our existence, there's more to our social relations, there's more to the fabric of the universe than what we see, and what we need to do is to cultivate and to develop an appreciation for digging deeper, for, participating with the black in the abyss and the dark in order to bring stuff out of that dark into the light, right? I think it is absolutely critical. So with that, I'm going to pause here and then begin with the objective manifestations of racism. So I'm going to pause now and come back in a second. Okay, so I'm going to begin with objective manifestations of racism. Just the last point to put on the board, number 5, was the denial of opportunities, right? So that standardized test can be used to deny opportunity. Obviously, it can be used to reaffirm and to create opportunity, but one and the same instrument can also be used to deny and to afford opportunity. So it's important that we recognize that. So bottom of page 8 then, the objective manifestations of racism and the criminalization of black skin. So what we've done is we've initially done our via, you might not think that this was informed by Cornel West's approach, but it was. This is not Cornel West, this is other theorists, but from what Cornel West said in terms of scientific revolution and its ability to impose racist practice in the name of quote-unquote scientific inquiry or scientific evidence, I wanted to show you that his argument is contemporarily legitimate. that we need to be vigilant and aware of the standardized tests that we impose on our students K through 12 and in university structures and such. And recognize that the validity of the tests and the instruments that are being used to assess validity and such need to account for cultural nuances, familial nuances, experiential nuances that may be specific to the majority culture, to the dominant culture, and recognize that insofar as we have questions or assumptions that are being made that refer to dominant experience, dominant culture, it is inappropriate and improper to generalize those while assessing a fairness in a test, right? You can't assess the test to be fair if portions of the test, significant or insignificant, require a knowledge, an experiential knowledge of culturally distinct practices and experiences. It's not fair. So, so does Brother West's account have legitimacy in a contemporary discussion of standardized tests? Absolutely. Could you use the example that I just gave of standardized testing to talk about the historical processes of racism and modern racism? Absolutely. Because we need to make sure that our science and our statistics is doing what it's supposed to do, which is always making fair, impartial, rational assessments of student performance. I don't care how hard the exam is, if it's fair, if it's impartial, if it's unbiased, then the complexity or difficulty of the test is not open to discussion. Students got to study for it. If the test, however, is unfair, biased, partial, that's a different story. Now we're not talking about fair assessments. Now we're not talking about complexity. What we're talking about is giving individual test takers advantages because of their life experience, and that's not appropriate, right? It should be equally hard for everybody. As an academic, that's my belief. You know, students will complain and moan, but that's not my problem. Study for your test. All right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to talk about, even though it's not here, it's in the background. We're going to talk, and this is, I'm borrowing this from section 1.1, we're going to talk now about West's second historical process, which was the emphasis on subjectivity via Cartesian philosophy, right? So that Descartes' emphasis on subjectivity as a means of informing bias, as a means of privileging Aryan embodiment, informs this next category, right? And this is the criminalization of the black skin. So theoretically, what are we talking about? Discrimination of racial groups, and this is between racial groups or among racial groups. So what we're going to be talking about here is the dominant group. D stands for dominant, and the so we're going to be talking about the dominant group and the subordinate group. So the dominant group and the subordinate group, marginalized, minority group, what have you. So essentially, it's a comparative or relational affair. So from a theoretical standpoint, one way in conceptualizing this tension in identity, subjective identity, is a consequence of inter-group conflict, right? So this would be inter-group conflict. In another lecture series, I talked about the concept of strike breaking, which really applies here as well. A lot of the stuff, what you will find out is the more you read, the more you learn, the less compartmentalized your knowledge becomes. Now, the more you read, the more you learn, the more holistic your knowledge becomes, and you just borrow from everything that you know. But I'll give you an example from another video that I've done because it applies here. The concept is one of strike breaking, and just super quick because it's not appropriate necessarily to belabor it here. You have a strike. The employer needs workers. His or her workforce is on strike. The employer goes to an ethnical group, a racial group, who's willing to work the same job for the same hours for less money, hires a lot of those laborers, and obviously those on strike are going to resent those who have done exactly their same job for exactly the same amount of hours for less money. And thus interracial conflict becomes a consequence of sort of labor market economics and such, as a quick example. Now, what's important here is to recognize that the tension is a tension as a consequence of the internal conflict with respect to group dynamics. There's a dominant culture and there's a subordinated culture, and the idea is you ought to know your place. Your place isn't to be doing the line of work that's meant for me to do. Your place is to do the line of work that's meant for you to do. Insofar as we're talking about, in a contemporary setting, United States of America, insofar as we're talking about sort of a recessed economy, I recognize that we're not in a recession, but at least a depressed economy. Everyone isn't doing what they wanted to do. The last job figures came out, I think it was like 74,000 people were employed. The numbers were lower, significantly lower than people expected. People are looking for work and blah, blah, blah. This is sort of the old hat. You can recognize now, I don't think the tension would be between blacks and whites as much as it would be between, and I hate to say it, but it's true, between whites and Hispanics, right? That, of course, Hispanic, the growth of the Hispanic population in the United States is rapidly growing. The economic power of the Hispanic community and the Hispanic quote-unquote dollar is more powerful than it's ever been. The representation of Hispanic culture and norms are propagated by Hispanic television and such, none of which I think is bad, but you recognize now that there is, to speak frankly, almost turf wars between the dominant culture, whites, and Hispanics. Why? Because you can do my job, speak my language, and speak your language, and I can't speak your language. So you can out-compete me in terms of linguistic ability. If there is a willingness, not to say that there's a willingness to work for less, but the idea is, now in terms with respect to another segment of the Hispanic community, those who are here illegally, immigration becomes this huge debate. There hasn't been a lot of immigration debate because I think we're not in the 2016 political cycle yet, but you better believe it's on the horizon. You better believe it. I mean, that's just obvious, right? There's no way we're going to get into our next election without having months and months and months and months of debate on this topic. But it's going to be a really complicated debate to have. Why? Because those Hispanic citizens who are here legally, yes, they represent a different ethnic group. Yes, they represent a different quote-unquote race. I don't believe in race. We talked about the mythological status of race, but you know, they represent a different ethnicity. They represent a different race. But the idea is those who are here legally serve as competition for any other white American citizen, and they might be able, Hispanic Americans might be able to outperform because of bilingual abilities. Those who have it. Obviously, you're more valuable to me, the employer, if you speak both Spanish and English, and if it's the case that a Hispanic American speaks both Spanish and English, and I can get quote-unquote more bang for my buck, there's increased competition there. The dollar value of those Hispanic Americans who are here legally also contributes to the United States of America, everything, the infrastructure, everything, just like anybody else's dollar. So to talk about Hispanic Americans and to generalize those who are here legally and those who are here illegally is a problem. Why? Because those who are here legally perform and contribute to American national identity just like blacks, whites, everybody else. Those who are coming to the United States illegally, we have to recognize that there is going to be an attempt. You better believe it. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure this out, just based on what we've seen historically, to demonize. They're the reason why our taxes are high, and they're the ones who are taking our jobs, and they're the ones who are bad, those Hispanics. Not recognizing that when we talk like this, we're disenfranchising an enormous community of Hispanic Americans who are here legally, who are law-abiding citizens, who are paying their taxes, who can offer potential more benefit, who can potentially offer a more beneficial employer-employee relationship because of any number of cultural nuances and bilingual ability. So that it's important to make sure from the outset, I've done my little 2 minutes of justifying my Hispanic brothers and sisters, and to sort of stand in unison with them, it's important to recognize that we ought not to generalize across the ethnicity, across the race, and demonize there is really no Spanish race, but to demonize Hispanic quote-unquote race, to demonize Hispanic ethnicity. Why? Because we need to make distinctions in people just like we would for any other racial group. Hispanic Americans contribute vastly to American national identity in terms of our defense, in terms of our education, in terms of economic investment, and we ought to keep that in mind. Our inclination is, however, anytime there's economic stress, the dominant group, and this is not just to sort of lock up the, lacquer. This isn't to compound white guilt, as much as it is just to be cognizant of the fact that very, very tense economic times typically result in scapegoating, and those who are least advantaged become the target for scapegoating. And in American culture contemporarily now, those who would be illegal immigrants who are here in the United States illegally. And a lot of the tensions that might mount, fortunately haven't mount, hopefully won't mount, but potentially could mount, would be directed against Hispanic Americans. And we need to make sure that we are aware of that. I have a responsibility to speak on that. We all have a responsibility to recognize that irrespective of what our politicians decide with respect to a pathway to citizenship and naturalization, irrespective of any of that, that's the decisions that they'll make. But yes, we'll elect those who we believe ought to be making decisions on the betterment or not of these community members. It's not up to us. Justice is not up to us. We don't live in a vigilante society, right? We're not responsible for ensuring the safety of the United States of America, for protecting the economic might of the U.S. It's not our job. Leave it to those in government who are charged with that responsibility, and that's the best that we can do, right? If you cross that line, you cross into vigilante justice, and you're going to end up winding yourself in trouble, right? So it's better that you not go that route, irrespective of what you might believe. Okay, so number 2, identification of the dominant group accompanied by normativization of group characteristics. Sort of obvious. The idea is you ought to be more like me. You ought to look more like me. You ought to speak the language I speak. How could you be here for so many years and you can't speak English yet? You ought to speak English. Why are all your road signs in Spanish? I don't understand that. This is America. It should be in English, not Spanish, and on and on. That's sort of this vibe. I want to make it real. I want you to feel it, and that's what it sounds like, right? Times have changed with respect to African Americans, so that the tension really isn't a black-white tension anymore. There is existing, obviously, black-white tension, of course, in the United States of America, but it's nowhere near the potential hotbed between whites and Hispanics because of competition, because of language distinction, because of sort of distinctions in writing and such. I can't read your language, I can't understand your language, and thus I can easily create this xenophobic, so you should know xenophobia, right, which is a fear of strangers. So there is a xenophobia against the things that we don't understand, the things that we can't readily absorb, assimilate, and thus we demonize that group. But like I said earlier, before I got to this point in the video, it's important. I mean, one of my goals is to learn. I'm not gonna learn Spanish, but one of my goals is to learn a foreign language before I die. I mean, who knows? I might learn Spanish, right? But I want to learn French. I'm thinking about learning French. I took French in graduate school, and I did well. I got an A. I forgot a lot of it, but French reads almost like English. The words I just have to, So I might do French. That's what I might learn. But French, Spanish, Italian, a lot of those languages, once you learn one, you can pick up another. But the idea is to have a more inclusive, right, understanding, and recognize that as we progress throughout society, as we evolve, we're going to always have to get new skill sets. Some of those skill sets might include learning other languages that aren't human languages. You might have to learn, forget Spanish, you might have to learn computer code in order to flourish in this next generation. We always are learning as human beings. So we shouldn't be averse to the opportunities that will be afforded if we learn. And this is why education is so important, because through education we have the opportunity to learn, and that opportunity allows for greater possibilities, right? We can actualize more of who we want to be because of the education that we've gained. So I'm a huge proponent of education, which is why I do this so much. Okay, so top of page 9, theoretical. Discrimination now within racial groups, right? So this was inter-group racial conflict. And what we're going to talk now about is intra-group racial conflict, right? So I-N-T-R-A. Right? And it's within. So within the racial group. So see my previous footnote on page number 2 on the previous page. And basically what I wrote, if you flip over to page 8, look at the bottom in the footnote. Dominant racial characteristics are imposed, and subordinate population mimics, emulates these characteristics by assuming the aesthetical sensibilities of the dominant group. Right? So angular, slim, I would even say almost too, not even slim, probably thin. Right? Angular, thin, pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, sort of the traditional. Right? That's the aesthetic. So that black women, Hispanic women ought to dye their hair. The lighter your hair, the lighter your skin color. You put in contacts, the more that you could potentially phenotypically assimilate with the expected aesthetical, right? The expected aesthetical sensibilities of the dominant culture. And obviously, as you move from one culture to another, this aesthetical sensibility changes. But in the United States of America, and I wouldn't go so far as to say that's it for the U.S., period. But you do see this a lot, right? There is a definitely an aesthetical sensibility for black women, Asian women. I think different groups of women have different aesthetical sensibilities. But just to do service to the analysis, the dominant aesthetical sensibility would be angular, thin, blonde hair, blue eye, female. I don't know if it would be blonde for men. Probably dark hair for men. Muscular, sort of that build. Tall, intellectually smart, blah, blah, blah. Not so much intellect on the women, though, right? It's more about the body and the look. And I'm not being facetious. This is sort of like the caricature. So you get the idea, right? So the exported racial characteristics having similar aesthetical values are associated with the benefits of bearing that aesthetical identifier. And basically all this means is if I look the part, I gain the advantages from looking the part. I don't look the part, but people have reminded me throughout the entirety of my life that I sound the part. So despite the fact that I look pretty much, tatted and black, when I speak, it's like, oh, well, the guy's got brains, he can talk well, so we'll cut him a pass. You better believe if I look like this and I talk like down south, southern, urban, it'd be a different story. There's no way. There's no way I'd be taken seriously. Is that good? Is that bad? It's not a matter of that. You do recognize that part of our aesthetical sensibility isn't just visual. Part of it is auditory. So that there is a particular sound. And that sound, I don't necessarily speak Midwest American English, but it's pretty close. My regular day-to-day speech is pretty close to that. I have more of probably a New England or Northeast accent. I don't speak with a Southern accent at all because I was raised in Brooklyn when I was young, and this is how I speak. So I don't have a Southern accent at all. So my accent is New England or Northeast American accent. But because of mom and because of education, there are aspects of my own speech that are a little bit more reticent of that Midwest vernacular. The point is, if I was coming up here and I was talking like this and you wouldn't understand what I was saying, you'd be like, damn, I don't understand what Dr. Campbell was talking about. That would be a problem, right? I can't, right? That aesthetical tone, it wouldn't ring true to your ear, to your sensibility, and you would immediately be able to identify me with the South. And unfortunately, being identified with the South, I don't know why this has been historically the case. I sort of know Civil War and all that, but to be affiliated or associated with Southern America is to be a few notches lower on the intellectual scale, a little bit slower, not as peppy, not as strategic. Is there truth to that? Of course not. It's absurd, but it is a fact of our aesthetical sensibilities. We, as Americans, have a particular sound that sounds like proper American English And if you can speak that way, in that tone, then you're letting people know, look, I'm not from the South, I'm from the North, I'm smart. Whereas if you have exactly the same life experience, and you can literally say the same words, but you say it with an accent, primarily a Southern accent, then it's like, yeah, he's a good guy, but, you know, he's really from the South, he's probably not too smart. So you get the idea. Obscene, absurd, absolutely. Now compound that with being from the South and being black, right? Not just white, because white people, you know, white people do this as well. It's just, it would be interesting to see why it's the case. I'm sure someone's published a book on why this is the case. But we do have a northern bias in the United States in terms of our aesthetical sensibilities with respect to how the language is used in speech. And we immediately assume that the use of the language with a Southern drawl connotes an inability to formulate your words properly, and thus lower intelligence and such. Okay, so number 2, Jim Crowism sought to operationalize an internally discriminatory practice which imposed a quote-unquote proper aesthetical value on the collective by associating the bearer of such aesthetic markers with the benefits of resembling the dominant aesthetic. And that's me writing. Basically what I'm saying here is that obviously we know what Jim Crowism is, and it is the institution of favoritism based on color. The lighter the color, the more the color of the individual looked like white, the more characteristics of white that was evident in the biology of the individual, the more benefits they got. And this is the canonical distinction between the house nigger and the field nigger. Right? If you're a house nigger, you got to live in the house with the master. You got to serve the master. You had advantages. The most obvious advantages was the willingness of the white community, especially those inside of the house, familiar, to trust you. Right? Obviously, you're preparing their meals. You're shaving their husbands and wives, and you're taking care of their children. And so you got trust. That's huge. Now, granted, you guys gotta watch Django. Django's just, oh, it's so good. I mean, you could literally, I could probably teach an entire class for a whole semester just by doing scene-by-scene breakdowns of Django. That would be dope, right? There's so much in that flick. And the scene where he talks about, I forget the old slave's name, Ben. I think his name was Ben. And he was like, you know, Uncle Ben or dear old Ben used to come out and shave Dad, you know, with a razor, and Dad would be there, and, you know, dear old Ben, which is probably like Uncle Ben. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. So, you know, would shave Dad with the razor, and at any time he could have slit his father's throat. And Ben never slit his dad's throat. Why? Because he was docile, and he was trained, and he was weak and effeminate, and he wasn't masculine and strong. He wasn't virile and dominant, right? It spoke to his subordination and the docility of his character and the docility of his being, of who he was. This idea, right, was so inculcated at the time that you recognize, well, I am going to control, because that's what Jim Crowism is about. I am going to be able, as the owner, as the white owner of the house, right, as the owner of the plantation, I am going to be able to control my slaves as a consequence of giving some of them advantages that others don't have. And what do you think that happens? Intra-group conflict, right? Some have advantages that others don't have. Well, yeah, well, Jason's the house nigga. Well, look at him. Jason talks like them. Jason has the advantages they got. Of course, Jason's got the job like they do. Jason's the house nigga. He's not one of us. I don't like Jason. Dr. Campbell, I don't want to hear about that guy. He's a house nigga. And what are you supposed to do? Say, no, I'm not. You know, this isn't white language. This is just language. You know, this is just the way people speak. No. You speak like them. You look like them. You have the skin color. Not me particularly, but you have the skin color like them. You're light like them. You're just like them. You're not one of us. So, I mean, I've read, unfortunately, accounts where people, with respect to our president Barack Obama, you know, his mom's white, his dad's black, and he's not black enough for the black community. He's too white for the black community. So some people will say, oh yeah, he's black, but you know, his mom's really white, so he's not really black. Well, imagine how that, and I know most people don't care how he feels, but the idea is, imagine what it must be like to be like, no, I'm black, right? Or I don't know what he identifies himself at, but I identify partially, or maybe even wholly, as black. And then the white community says, well, he's definitely not white, right? He's definitely not white. Why? Because his dad's black, and his wife's black, and his kids are black. So he's not black. So where's he left? Well, he's not black, he's not white. I mean, he's the president, so who cares? I wouldn't care. Like, I'm not black or white, I'm the president. That's all you need to know. But that's just me. That's why I'm not there. But the idea is, you can imagine, right? You find yourself in a position where no one is willing to accept you for who you are. Why? Because of this intra-group conflict. The Jim Crowism was designed, and it is absolutely still alive and functioning well, to keep black people hating on black people. She got Indian hair. She don't have Indian hair. Her skin looks bad. Her hair is bad. She got bad hair. I got bad hair. Black people talk like this. Black people talk like this. You're not one of us. You sound like them. You are Uncle Tom. You a house nigger. Is that going to incentivize me to hang with this group anymore? If every time I come around they remind me that I don't sound like them, so I'm not part of the group? No. Intra-group racial conflict is the bane of the black experience in America. It is the bane. Everyone talks about white on black violence, blah, blah, blah. It really is black people and African Americans' internal conflict within the community, and there has to be a recognition that, hey, we're all one and the same. Let's, I guess the kumbaya thing it's fanciful. And so, not we're all one and the same, let's walk into the sunlight, because I know that's never going to happen. But the idea is someone needs to be leading the charge, right? We need a new generation. I'm not going to be the new generation Cornel West, but someone needs to be the next generation Martin Luther King. Well, no, maybe I will be the next generation Cornel West. I like it. I like the academic side. I'm not the activist. This is not who I am. I'm not into activism. I tried it with respect to Occupy. It's just not my style. I don't like the feel of it. It seems futile. If I were to have grown up in the 60s, I might have a different outlook. I feel like I have more power and I do more social good from lecturing. So I am an academic, and I don't, it doesn't bother me to be like, oh, I'm not in the trenches, fighting the activist war. But you better believe, if you want to have your rights recognized, if you want to have less intra-group black-on-black violence, less horizontal violence within the black community, and this is something that you might stand for, you're going to need to understand how you go about resolving these conflicts. And the first thing to recognize is that there is no good or better. There is no good or better. There is no good or worse in terms of characteristics that define human beings. Hair is hair. Skin color is skin color. We have to get beyond that. If we can't get beyond that, we cannot expect the dominant racial group to I don't want to say to take us seriously, because that sounds way too harsh, but you can't expect them to sympathize with our plight if we're constantly fighting each other. And thus our social progress, this next generation of social activism, really needs to be about intra-conflict resolution within the black and African American community. It's not about us versus others, it's about us versus ourselves. And we need to be able to conceptualize how we might do that in terms of our social relations, and who knows how that will manifest. So I'm going to pause here for a little bit, and then I will continue with the practical applications of what I said, and wrap up this rather lengthy section 1.2. Okay, so the middle of page 9, practical discriminate. So the practical application of inter-group racial conflict. So we're going to talk about practical applications of comparative racial group conflict. And this doesn't just have to be like white on black crime or white on black tension. It could be any number of inter-group racial conflict and the dynamics thereof. So, with respect to black men, so number one, this is middle of page 9. Public opinion studies suggest that black men are commonly associated with images of violence and aggression. Duh. Not to the author, but that's like, of course. And the idea is that, and I'll read it again, public opinion studies suggest that black men, like myself, are commonly associated with images of violence and aggression. What ends up happening in this relationship, and I said this in the last video that I did, at least I think it was for this race. In terms of the perception, the individual black man is perceived by society as referring to ultimately violence and aggression. That is the threat. The black man is seen as being a threat. So that when you see me, irrespective of the fact that I have, well, maybe not now, not in this context, but you see me on the street, right? Irrespective of the fact that I have a PhD, the fact that I've published books and I contribute hundreds and hundreds of hours worth of free lectures to the globe, and all of the facts of my existence thus far, the stuff reflected on my CV, and even stuff that aren't on my CV, like this, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence, right, demonstrative proof that I am a social contributor, I am an academic, just the presence of my skin color, coupled especially with the tattoos, just those two things, my skin color, well, three things, my skin color, my masculine identity, and the tattoos that I have is enough to already criminalize me, on sight. On sight. Hey, what's up? There's a black guy here. He looks a little suspicious. What's going on? In terms of Hispanic identity, I think it's in Arizona. I want to say it's in Arizona. I'm not sure. Maybe Alabama. I forget. A southern city. There was a huge uproar about the felonization of Chicana and Chicano identity. You can imagine young brown boys and girls, young brown men and women walking along the street, and you're stopped by the authority, by the local police, representative of the government, and you're asked for identification to prove that you're a citizen. Now, despite the fact that I might not look like I'm a citizen, what is the justification of me having to fork out ID to show you on command that no, I'm really here I'm here legally? I understand the pros and the cons. I understand why you might, under certain circumstances, need to do this, and why you might not on others. I'm not here to argue that. I don't care about the argument about is it just or unjust. That's not my role here. My role is to show you that assumptions are made about the character of a person on sight. On sight. It's very difficult to understand what that feels like, right? What it is to be black like me. What that feels like if you haven't experienced it yourself. Right? It's not until you become the PhD, it's not until you become the university professor, it's not until you've graduated other PhDs and you conferred the highest title on others and still feel like you're perceived as, not just by whites, by blacks as well. You go to the mall and they look at you like you're a thug. You go to the barber shop and they're asking you for hookups on drugs. You go talk to this guy and he thinks that you're a gangbanger. You talk to this other guy, he thinks that you're pimping prostitutes, and you think to yourself like, what am I doing wrong? Now, I can't say this because I recognize how I look. Right? I recognize how I look. I'm tatted head to toe. I'm black, I'm tall. I get it. So I understand why people have that look. With me specifically. The truth of the matter is that I don't want people to know who I really am, right? I'd rather people not know me, because the real me is very boring academic. I love this stuff. I get a buzz. My neurons are just humming when I'm in here lecturing and reading and writing. I love, I get a high from studying. But I don't want people to know that. I want people to think I'm an idiot, so that when they meet me for the first time, their guard's down and I can really get a sense of who they are. Right? It's sort of like undercover boss, but I'm not anybody's boss. I just want to be undercover. I don't want anybody to know. I don't want anybody to know that I am who I am. I'd rather you think I'm an idiot and leave me alone. So, not me specifically, but you can imagine how tedious it must be time and time again for people to believe that you are something that you're not. Right? It's obviously taxing, especially where that identity is associated with violence. And you know, I've read articles on this before. I'm not going to bring it in here, nor did I bring it up. But people talk about the TV series. I think it might even be the longest running TV series, Cops, as being detrimental to black male identity Again, pros and cons with that, right? The fact of the matter is, were the producers overrepresenting blacks in terms of incarceration on the show? Maybe yes. Does that overrepresentation reflect an overrepresentation in terms of our penitentiary system? Well, it probably does, yes. So you can't really blame the producers then, right? There are other social structures in place that is influencing the high rate of incarceration for black men. Police profiling, obviously, applies to some of that. But to say that police profiling is overwhelmingly the reason why incarceration rates are so much higher for blacks than whites would require a little bit more sort of justification statistically. I would be willing to entertain a discussion on that, but you would have to have pretty solid statistical evidence to demonstrate that. I think more, and this is just me, I think more what accounts for the perception of violence in black masculinity, at least in a contemporary account, has to do with just thuggery, just the absolute adoration of thuggery in the urban young black community. Pac was what I thought when I was a kid, just the ultimate manifestation of thug. But Pac really didn't do much until like the end of his life, where he was doing stupid stuff, kicking people and beating people up in Las Vegas hotels, and he got killed for that. But other than that, if you really look at what Pac did, people tried to shoot him, but you never saw him doing anything else. He had some tattoos, he spoke really aggressively, but he wasn't as aggressive as NWA. But you take Tupac compared to some of the contemporary rappers, and I'm just like, wow, it's night and day. It's complete night and day. Because I'm biased because I'm old school, and this is a bit of nostalgia. I'll warrant that, I'll concede that. But I don't hear Pac's music in the same way that I hear this music, and when I hear contemporary rap, all I hear is bloodshed and violence and thuggery and thug life all day. Far more dangerous and ominous than anything Pac ever rhymed, ever. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm not here to say that. I watched Russell Simmons say in an interview as an exec, it's not my responsibility to censor the artist. The artist has something he wants to say. The artist says it. He's aggressive. He's violent. In my lectures, I've given a shout out to Chief Keef. I'm gonna give a shout out to Chief Keef right now. Shout out to Chief Keef. Keep it 300. Chief Keef makes some amazing music. It's that type of music that'll get you really aggressive, really mad at the world. I mean, but should we live in a world that's completely safe and secure and rose petals for everyone and there's no cuts and no bruises? No. Part of our lived experience as blacks, whites, Hispanics, everybody, is confrontation with conflict and pain, with aggression, with external threats. That is part of life. It has been part of life. It will continue to be part of life. And we do need some of our artists to represent that. So shout out to Chief Keef for representing it. Do we need all of our artists to represent that? That's the problem, right? No. Because then it really fortifies the belief that when you see me, and when you see others like me, irrespective of who he might be, you just think, oh, well, it's like Chief Keef. Like, I heard this one rapper, and this kid is mad as hell. And all black people are angry, and all black women are upset, and all black men are violent, right? And that's unfair. And that's unfair, right? Clearly, that's unfair. So it's more complicated than even the authors acknowledge, because unlike some others, I will acknowledge a social relevance for that type of music. I think people go through phases in their life, and some people need to find themselves in a phase where that music helps them do whatever it is they're seeking to accomplish. You might not think that it does, but I'm telling you, as someone who's attained a lot of what I attained was a consequence of that type of music. I'm in a different space in my life now, and the things that I'm trying to do in this next phase of my life, I don't get the same energy that I need from listening to that music. I'm nostalgic for it, but it doesn't feed me as much as it used to. I don't need to fight as much because I've attained a lot. The next things that I have to do in my life require more nuanced subtleness, and I need to listen to more subtle music. I need to listen to something more suggestive, not so overt and stuff. But I do believe, I recognize and I live the experience of public perception of me specifically, and men like me specifically, being violent, and it's continually my obligation and society's obligation to respect the fact that I might look like this. Right? This is my thug motivation. I forget what it was that I was doing a rap in a beater. It is my responsibility to present myself authentically. Authentically, I am tatted. I do consider myself sort of ghetto in terms of mentality. I am absolutely hip-hop. But I'm also educated, and I'm also not here to hurt people, and I'm not here to propagate anger and aggression, right? So you can be both things. It's difficult to do it, but you can be both things. So 1A, the manner of this association is one designed to delegitimize, I shouldn't put the any, delegitimize any instance of violence or aggression as warrantable. And what does that mean? If you are presented as being the threat to society, as being quote-unquote a menace to society, then the external gaze on me undermines legitimate uses of aggression and violence. There are instances in which you should be upset. There are instances in which people disrespect your family, disrespect your home, disrespect your wife, disrespect your kid, disrespect you, that you ought to be upset, that you are justified in being upset. But because you're black, you can't act on that disgust, on that inclination to use violence, on that inclination to debase another person. Why? Because that's exactly the justification they need to say, see, he's just like the rest of them. So what do you end up doing? It's really complicated and it's really difficult. You know, people end up disrespecting you. They disrespect your family, they disrespect your wife, they disrespect you in your home, in front of your home, in front of your wife, in front of your kids. And what are you supposed to do? Turn the other cheek. Ah, man. That's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard pill to swallow. But at the end of the day, if it gets really bad, one thing I found out, it's not about me seeking retaliation on someone else or me ordering retaliation on someone else. I pick up the phone, I call Uncle Sam up. Uncle Sam, I need your help. This is the United States of America, and if the conflict is too big for the individual, rather than taking it to the streets and handling it yourself, I know this is easier said than done, but rather than handling the conflict yourself, call the people who are responsible for handling those types of conflicts, right? And let them sort out the grievances. Because at the end of the day, yeah, you get a notch in your belt that you're macho, and oh, nobody's ever gonna punk me, and yeah, I'm never gonna be soft, and no one's gonna threaten me and challenge me. But it's not really our responsibility, right, as black men. And you know, this year, hopefully, if not next year, sometime, even if I just give money and I can't go because of time, I want young black men, children, you know, 14, 15, 16-year-old black kids to recognize that you don't have to think that you're a punk if you call for help. You don't have to think that you're soft if you call for help. Because society will create situations in which you almost feel you have to use violence in order to protect yourself, or feel you have to use violence in order to defend yourself, or defend the honor of your girlfriend or your wife or your family or what have you, your neighborhood, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But the truth of the matter, it's all in your head. It really is. At the end of the day, all of that delusion is in your head. And there are people out there whose job it is to make sure that you're protected. So go to those people, right? Don't use that power that you have by yourself. Why? Because you're going to end up in jail. You're going to end up dead. And at the end of the day, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. It's better to do it right and live a long, happy life than to do it wrong and find yourself in the tomb way too early. So 1B, the collective grouping of black men as homogenized and generalized as being violent justifies the racial discrimination between the peaceful whites and the savage blacks. Right, so that you have the old discourse of the civil and the civilized and the savages. If you are the type of black man who is prone to be very defensive, intellectually even, it doesn't even have to be violent, intellectually defensive, they'll use that. They, sort of the norm, the masses, the majority, will use that against you. It's difficult to find yourself in positions, and I've lived my entire life like this, where I teach for a living. I've broken my voice in probably about a week ago for the new, actually probably about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago when I started doing these lectures. About 20 hours of lectures in, my voice breaks in. I can lecture forever now. I speak at a rather high pitch, just normally, not pitch, but high sort of sound, booming voice, because projection is important. And people are, this is offensive. Why are you so angry? Why are you so aggressive? Why do you look like that? I'm not trying to be anything. This is who I am as a person. But I'm constantly reminded of my blackness in the university, outside of the university, because any inflection, any gesture of the hand, any sudden movement is perceived as a threat. And there's always an attempt, as my own personal experience, I'm not talking about something I read in a book, my own personal experience, to try and make me feel uncomfortable about who it is that I am. Knowing that I'm never going to choke anybody or slap anybody or hit anybody. But Jason, just the way you talk, just the way you move your hands, just the way that you stand, it's a little bit too authoritarian. You're a little too loud. You're a little too intimidating. You're a little too aggressive. And the point is, well, what would you have me be? Docile, right? Docile and quiet and reserved. And this is attention. This is attention. I'm not saying that others don't experience it, but as a black man, I know all too well the power of an individual seeking to, quote-unquote, keep you in check. But more intellectually defined, it is the attempt to pacify the primacy of the black experience, right? I see myself as educator. I'm confident in my ability. I'm confident in my knowledge, in my control of the language, in my control of the theory, of my control of the complexity of ideas, and I speak with assertion. I don't have to check people. I don't have to ask for permission. I don't have to deliberate. I know, so I speak as though I know. And that assurance comes across as a threat for those who might not have the same assurance. But is that my problem or is that their problem? It's certainly not my problem. And this is what we need to recognize. There needs to be more discourse, not just on race, but on all of the baggage that surrounds race. All of the gesticulations, all of the movements and mannerisms, intonation, tone, intent, all of that needs to be discussed, because being black is more than just having black skin, right? It's profoundly deeper than just having black skin. And unfortunately, part of, especially being a black man, is the look of threat, right? It's the look of the potential aggression that inheres allegedly within the black man, which is problematic. And then number 2 under black men, quote, in an experiment using photographs of white and black men, and this is comparative obviously, this is inter, police officers were more likely to falsely identify a subject as an offender where they appeared more stereotypically black. And you know what that means: darker skin, broader nose, wide lips, coarse hair. Thus, the appearance of one's blackness is associated with the inherency of violence. Right? The fact that you look black is associated with the appearance of violence, and thus the retaliation as a consequence of allegedly defensive means. I mean, this unfortunately came to its culmination in the murder of Trayvon Martin, right? Zimmerman, I forget his name, but Zimmerman said that he saw Trayvon as a threat. Trayvon has Skittles and Arizona iced tea and a hoodie on, and because he had the hoodie on, because he was partially cloaked, because his skin was black, because he was tall, because he had a little bass in his voice, that then served as the justification for his murder? Absolutely not. Now, whether or not Zimmerman was justified in it, legally or not, is not the question here, right? I don't particularly care about the debate as to whether it was legal or illegal. The courts have decided his actions were legal. As far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the discussion. What's at stake here is that he died, that he was murdered, and that as a consequence of his murder, he had no gun. He presented really no threat, right? And I guess the debate on whether or not he presented a threat is also arguable, so I'll concede that he presented no threat, but he had no weapon, right? So that the idea is the presentation of his image was itself enough to justify this defensive lethal measure And that is undeniable. That is a fact, irrespective of what side of the argument you fall on. And the idea is just to take note of the fact that being black can get you killed. Being black can get you arrested. Being black can get you questioned. Being black can get you interrogated. Being black can get you locked up, detained. Just being black. Right? I think more so we need to be very vigilant. That is, those of us in the African American and black communities need to be very vigilant, because this is potentially a similar problem for Hispanic Americans, right? Being Hispanic, especially in South Florida, can get you in trouble. Why? Because if you're suspected to be here illegally, you could be deported. Right? So being Hispanic or looking Hispanic could get you deported. It can get you kicked out of the United States of America, especially, obviously, if you're not here legally. So there is a lot here with respect to the aesthetical, right? And how the aesthetical role facilitates a justification or an unjust mode of questioning and deporting and harassing, if some people might say, or profiling others. Some people will think that what the social practice is just. Some people will think the social practice is unjust. We'll discuss that more in a bit. I'm going to pause here and then continue with black women on the bottom of page 9. Okay, so to return to the discussion on black women at the bottom of page 9 of my notes, here's the quote. Quote, the bottom of page 9, "Black men are more often stereotyped as aggressive and violent, while black women are more commonly taken to be lazy and chronic welfare users." That is, in comparison with their white counterparts, right? And this is the cliche, right? The idea is, in terms of the relationship between the aesthetical presentation of the black feminine subjective identity, the black female subjective identity, this is more 80s, right? 80s, 90s. It was assumed that, well, when we talk about black women, when you look at a black woman, obviously she's a recipient of welfare. Obviously she has a ton of children out of wedlock, and there might be, several babies' fathers, baby daddies as they call it. And this is the assumption of the black woman experience based on nothing more than just the presentation of the black woman. In a contemporary account, 2014 and such, I think it's less about the black welfare mother and more about the angry black woman. The attempt is always to cast the black woman as being upset or perturbed or easily excitable, very aggressive, very assertive, very domineering, always upset and out of control with her emotions. Women, historically speaking, black or white, have had to deal with this alleged hysteria that they suffer, that they quote-unquote suffer from. And I'm not going to go into sort of a genealogy of hysteria with respect to feminist identity. But the idea is women have been, historically speaking, charged as being hysterical. And the black woman is not impervious to this historical attack against feminine identity. So the black woman is now, contemporarily speaking, she's seen as being angry. She's seen as being upset. She's recalcitrant. Well, yeah, recalcitrant, I was trying to use it, and that is the appropriate time to use it now. She's seen as being recalcitrant, right? The idea that a black woman could, and just like with the black man, right? The idea that a black woman might be justified in her discomfort, and that she might be justified in vocalizing her discomfort as a means of protecting self, protecting interest, protecting business, community, what have you, is thwarted by the assumption that she can't be angry. She can never be upset. Why? Because if she's angry, if she's upset, if she's ever out of control of her emotions, it's a justification. See? There, I showed you. I told you she'd eventually snap. I told you she'd eventually be upset. She'd eventually cuss and such. And this idea, you see this in cinema all the time. Jackie Robinson movie is a perfect example of this. They prod and they poke and they agitate and they try to provoke Jackie Robinson into finally becoming the aggressor. into finally becoming the bully and fighting back. And in a sense, you want him to fight back. Like they've been, I mean, nigger, you're never going to be this. They challenge his manhood, and they threaten his life, and they threaten his wife, and they, you know, it's consistent. And you, as the viewer, want him to fight back. But then you recognize the instance that he does, the instance he fight back, the instance that he, quote unquote, stands up for himself, is the very instance at which he loses everything that he's worked so hard for. And this is a very precarious position to be in as a human being, irrespective of being a minority or not. It's a very precarious position to be, on the one hand, completely and consistently the source of hate, of social pressure, of social suspicion, of social indignation, right? To always be the bad guy, to always be made to feel as though you were the bad guy, and in a sense want to retaliate against that, right? Well, if I'm going to be the bad guy, well, might as well I just be the best bad guy you ever saw. That move is precisely the wrong thing to do, right? That move legitimizes and justifies the really disgusting aesthetical correlation that's made between the physical presentation of a person's body and their skin color and the texture of their hair, their eyes, their lips, their nose, and some rather ad hoc, arbitrary, completely irrelevant correlation that suggests that you're angry, you're upset, you're violent, you're aggressive, right? So that the idea is, it really is in some sense a catch-22. If you don't do anything, you put yourself in a position to be habitually disrespected, threatened, challenged. If you do something physically against the aggressor, against what you perceive to be the aggressor, against what you perceive to be the insult, and I'm not saying that it's not an insult. Sometimes it's very clear, like, you know, can you sell me some drugs, right? In front of your home, you can imagine someone would say something ridiculous like that. But any number of ridiculous things I don't want to vocalize. The idea is you can't give into that. Why? Because the instant that you do give into that, black woman or black man, the basis is the same, right? You are needy, but insofar as you're needy, you're also aggressive and agitated, and it can't work for our own advantage. It can't work for our own advancement. So what we as African Americans need to do is recognize that we need to sort of fight the good fight. You need to rely on those institutions, hopefully, that are there. Granted, we're not talking about an era where the institutions were against us and designed to oppress us. This is a contemporary account. The government is supposed to be here for all of us. Situations arise where you feel that you're being challenged, disrespected, threatened. No matter how ridiculous it is, call the authorities, right? Do your bit to make sure that you let people know that I perceive this as a threat. I'm not going to do anything physical against who I perceive to be the aggressor, unless he's literally or she's literally coming against me. Then you use, you know, this is the state of Florida. You can use deadly force, obviously. But irrespective of that, level of threat, call those who are in positions to protect. So yeah, it's in terms of discrimination among groups, you recognize that inter-group racial conflict is going to be such that you are made to feel as a minority of any race, of any ethnicity, you're going to be made to feel inferior. You're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, your eyes don't look the right way, your nose, your lips don't look the right way, your hair isn't the appropriate texture, you don't talk in the proper vernacular, you're too muscular, you're not muscular enough, you're too feminine, you're not feminine enough. No matter what you do, you're not going to feel that sense of inclusive experience. You're not going to have that sort of inclusive experience with the national identity, partly because the national identity, and I talk about this in my race and ethnicity, not race and ethnicity, my ethnicity and nationalism, so I'm not going to go into it too much now. And I've seen some changes for the better. So this is why I love reason and logic. You know, people people are open to being fair. But traditionally speaking, and I don't necessarily believe this, I think this is already starting to change, but traditionally speaking, to be American is to be white American, right? White being the ethnicity. But the ethnicity of whiteness is never discussed. It's never disclosed. All that's disclosed is American. So when you evoke the term American, independent to any hyphenation, then it presupposes sort of Anglo-white American identity. It's only when you qualify the type of American that you're speaking of that you need to hyphenate it with African American, Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native, what have you. This is changing. I've already seen contemporary efforts to change this, and I think it ought to change. I think its change will be for the better. Thus, either we're all Americans or we're all identified as our ethnicity and American identity, and thus it's fair. All right. Could it be better? Sure. Am I going to conceptualize some better state of affairs? No, I'm not really interested in that. Okay, I'll leave that to the next generation of activists and such. Okay, so then finally, lastly, on page 10, we have 3 bullet points we need to cover in terms of intra-racial conflict, right? Conflict that pits African Americans against African Americans, Hispanic Americans against Hispanic Americans. Conflict in which, and this isn't to be some ominous, boogeyman theory where there's some grand orchestrators having African Americans fight African Americans. I'm from impoverished communities. I lived impoverished for all of my adolescence and my early adulthood. I see what black people do to other black people. Right? I see how black people talk to other black people. There's no conspiracy theory here, right? There has to be an acknowledgement, and Bill Cosby is absolutely right about this point. There's some things that he says that I don't quite like, but the truth of the matter is the man's right. We have to be responsible for our own care. We have to be responsible for raising our own children. We have to be responsible for our own communities. You cannot expect white people, quote unquote, the dominant culture, to take the onus of responsibility for our community. We have to be responsible for that. Now, there are any number of complications that might arise as a consequence of living in a contemporary society, a diverse society with huge disparities in socioeconomic interests, right? But the idea is, I'm not here to play the blame game, right? I don't teach blame game. What I teach is accountability. We need to be held accountable by ourselves, for ourselves, such that we recognize, no, it's our responsibility to protect our children from this type of music. It's our responsibility to make sure that our children understand the importance of education. It's our responsibility to make sure that when our young boys and our young girls go outside, they're appropriately dressed, they look appropriate, they speak with pride by using the proper English vernacular, and they don't feel ashamed to use it. We need to take that initiative. We need to assume that responsibility. And I recognize it's far more complicated than just saying we need to assume the responsibility, but I'm not telling other black Americans and African Americans to do things that I haven't done myself. Right? I've applied this to my own life. I've applied these principles to the raising of my own children, and the idea is I wouldn't be teaching this if I didn't think it would do others good. So it's not that I'm telling people to do things that I don't do myself. I practice this myself. I raise my children in this way. I believe it's our responsibility as black Americans, as African Americans, to make sure that we acknowledge, of course, the hypocrisy in all of this. Should it be the case that I act a certain way when someone has, should I always allow people to disrespect me? Should I always allow people to threaten me in front of my home, threaten my children, threaten my wife? Should it always be the case that I turn the other cheek? No. Should I be able to retaliate and to let other men know that I'm not going to allow you to intimidate my family, me? I'm not going to allow you. Of course it should be the case that I can do that. But I don't live in that society. I live in a society where I'm a black man, and if I act in that manner, I lose. So what ought I to do? I ought to do what I told you to do before. Call the authorities and let them handle it. People look at you and say, oh, well, he's weak. Oh, he doesn't have any courage. He's scared. You can call it whatever you want to call it. What you're not going to call it is me getting locked up, and what you're not going to call it is me ending up in the tomb over some stupid shit. That's what's not going to happen. And far too often, especially young African American boys and men, they have this sentiment that they have to honor the community and themselves and their family against disrespect, which is important because you should not be disrespected to begin with. But that attempt to try and seek almost a vigilante justice for what is seemed to be, or what is clearly an instance of disrespect, winds a lot of people in trouble that they don't need to be in. Right? All right. So intra-racial, right? This is discrimination within racial groups. So number one, so you can see now, we talked about the aesthetical, we talked about science, and the role of standardization in testing. And what we're going to talk about now is the objective identity of the person as subject. And a lot of this is going to pertain to criminality and criminal behavior, at least the allegations of criminal behavior. Why is that important? Because our identity, unfortunately, Black and Chicano, Chicana, Hispanic identity is often criminalized. You look like, profiling manifests in criminalized identity. It's the whole point of profiling. The point of profiling is the assumption that this person is up to something criminal, and as a consequence of the perception, I, as an officer of the law, am obligated to protect against criminal behavior, and there's something devious here. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is the subjective identity of Black and Hispanic men primarily, and women also, leads them into the penitentiary system. Whether it is a consequence of profiling, or whether it is a consequence of seeking to live out that criminality through thug life and through thuggery, I think it's a little bit of both. I think on the one hand, there are some elements in which you cannot deny that racial profiling has contributed to the overrepresentation, in some regard, of African Americans and Hispanics in the penitentiary system. To say that it's wholly the case, I think it's absolutely do a disservice. Why? Because I listen to the music. I know what the music is saying, and I know what because I was there at one point in my life. I didn't break the law, but you know, you want to sort of emulate the aesthetic of thug life, right? Without actually being a thug, without actually going out and selling drugs and doing bad stuff. You want to play the part. You want to look the part, because the part, it's sexy. I mean, looking the part is sexy. Let's just call it what it is. The unfortunate fact is, I don't think, again, shout out to Cosby for this, and his speech, which is known as, I don't think I've ever lectured about this, but you should know the name of the speech. It's called A Pound, and I'm officially out of black ink. The name of Cosby's speech is The Pound Cake. Pound Cake speech. Google it, and listen to it or read it. It's a very provocative speech. It's a very provocative speech. But we're talking about Bill Cosby here, right? Bill Cosby championed the representation of Black identity as being just regular, old, average, everyday middle-class identity. We're just like any old other regular, boring middle-class family with the same problems, the same challenges, no different, right? So the Cosby Show pioneered this transformation in identity, so you can recognize. I cut Bill Cosby more slack than I would cut someone else, because he's not just talking about it. I mean, the guy lived it. He was already established, but he solidified his iconic status with the Cosby Show, and he demonstrated, and all the spin-offs, and he demonstrated his devotion, his adamant devotion to the representation of Black identity as being just like any old, ordinary middle-class identity. It's just middle-class identity, middle-class American identity as represented through a Black family. So I can understand why, in the Pound Cake speech, Bill Cosby is as upset as he is with the Black community for failing to live up to the expectations of family, the expectations of society, of class, to live up to the expectations of child rearing at its base. And he's repulsed, if you will. He's repulsed by what he sees, and he condemns a lot of the contemporary practices. Now, that's Cosby. I'm not going to be as severe because I come from sort of a very hip-hop generation. He comes from the generation before hip-hop. Hip-hop was born when I was born. So I come from hip-hop. Hip-hop is the only thing I've ever known. And despite the fact that I'm probably stepping 1 or 2 steps away from hip-hop, I'm still very much hip-hop. I'm just waiting for the appropriate music to appeal to me, which that might never happen. Some new instantiation of hip-hop, because I don't particularly like conscious rap either. But the idea is, in terms of this representation, a lot of hip-hop still pays homage to criminality. It pays homage to thuggery. It pays homage to violence. It pays homage to misogyny. It pays homage to just the most obscene, decadent, opulent aspects of American lifestyle. And while the rappers and the lyricists are getting paid and wealthy off of this, the consumers aren't. Right? They're not. They live this lifestyle and they end up finding themselves incarcerated. Is it good? Is it bad? I'm not here to say. What I would say is I believe artists have a freedom to speak what they want to speak. So if you want to spew that, you have every absolute right, this is America, to spew it. Do people need to buy it? That's a different story. Am I going to discourage people from buying it? Absolutely not. Well, Dr. Campbell, you just seem to be sort of objectively detached, and that's exactly what I am. I'm objectively detached. I'm not here to preach. I'm not here to tell people how to raise their children. You live the life you want to live. What I'm here to tell you is the objective fact that if you are exposed at a very young age to this lifestyle, to this interpretation of masculinity in terms of thuggery, and you allow that interpretation of masculinity in terms of thuggery to manifest in your life, in terms of what you do, you're going to grow up to become a thug. And thugs end up in jail or dead. So that's where it's going, as a fact. I'm emotionally detached from the facts. My job here isn't to tell you what you ought or ought not to do. It's that you increase the statistical likeliness likelihood that you're going to end up in dead or in jail if you adopt this as a lifestyle. Right? So this subjective identity will culminate the three characteristics of the historical process discussed by Cornel West. The first being, in no particular order, but the first being the scientific role in, he talked about scientific revolution, but the role of science in propagating racist ideologies, specifically white supremacy. We got a sense of that, granted an attenuated sense of it. It wasn't as potent, but an attenuated sense of this via the initial discussion on standardized testing. We talked about aesthetics and the classical revival as per Cornel West, and we got a sense of this with respect to the attempt to discriminate based on appearance, sort of the aesthetic without reference to the real subjective identity of the person, only looking at the person and looking at the person's body and how the person is built, how the person looks, how the person presents themselves as associated with either being a welfare queen or being a violent thug or being an aggressive woman and such. And now what we're going to look at is subjective identity and how subjective identity can get you incarcerated. So, number one, discrimination based on one's racial group has been widely examined in the past, but a relatively new body of research explores discrimination within racial groups, particularly in regard to perceived darkness and lightness of a black individual's skin tone. So now we're not comparing whites against blacks, whites against Hispanics, blacks against Hispanics. No. What we're talking about, more Jim Crowism, is the intra-group dynamics of privileging some members of an intra-racial group because of characteristics that conform with the dominant or the majority group, and demonizing or disenfranchising or dehumanizing others because their characteristics aren't shared by the dominant group. In terms of the shared characteristics, what we're identifying is the pigmentation of skin, skin tone, skin color. So this will be a conversation on coloration. It is in part wedded to the aesthetical, obviously, right? When we're talking about aesthetics, as we said in the last section, or the last part of this section, this has been a very long section, but as we said in the last part of this section, the aesthetical presentation of skin color is important. What we're going to do now, however, is to see how that aesthetical presentation of skin color directly corresponds statistically now, and I found good research on this, so you might want to read this citation at the top. Read this article, it's an interesting article, how skin color affects sentencing, right? The lighter you are, the less likely you are to do as much time as those who committed exactly the same crime but are darker than you are. So remember what we did. Oh, we haven't done, no, I haven't done it yet, so I'm not even going to talk about it because I haven't discussed it yet. I made the notes for myself, but it's many, many chapters ahead, so I can't even talk about it because I would be jumping the gun. Okay, so 1A, here's the argument, right? So since, and I'm just going to read 1A, B, and C, and then I'll go through and explain each, because it's my analysis, but it's my analysis from the reading in argument form. It's not the greatest argument, I could have done this better were I publishing this, but for a lecture, this is good enough. So since the perception or appearance of blackness among the races, which is the aesthetical, among the races, that is, in comparison between the races, is used to justify violence, it follows that the same approach can be and is used to access proclivities towards violence and criminal behavior within the race. Actually, I do need to explain that. Since we can talk about interracial, inter-ethnic violence, then obviously we can talk about intra-race, intra-ethnic, intra-group violence. But more importantly, we can look at the ability for members of the majority or dominant group, the hegemon, to be able to create division within racial groups by means of gradation in color, right? Is it fair to say that two people do exactly the same crime and that one person does less time than the other? And the only reason that the person did less time than the other is because the person is lighter. Same race, both blacks, but this person looks more Anglo, has more characteristics of whites than the other. What I think is a bit weird about the article that the author has written is that it assumes latently, though it doesn't say this explicitly, that there should be a more strict, and this might not be the author's intent, but it would have been a disservice for the author not to recognize the implication of his or her, it's a group of people, their research, is that lighter skin shade does not warrant now the same amount of incarceration time, right? The crime is the same, but the punishment is different. And it seems to be suggested that we need to revisit that. I think that can be very, very dangerous suggestion, but the likelihood that that's a consequence of this type of research is inherent. If you're saying that one person, that members of the same exact race who do exactly the same crime are getting different punishments, and that those who look more black are getting more severe punishments than those who look more white, then yes, you might want to say that you want to alleviate some of the punishment, but that's probably not going to happen. Which is also a consequence of this type of research, what's probably going to end up happening is those who look more white, those who have more features of the dominant group, ought to be punished the same, which seems to suggest a more severe punishment. And I don't know how the author would respond to such a critique, but that's an implication, right? That's definitely an implication of this research, and it doesn't quite sit well with me. Despite the fact that I do believe it's interesting to note that because you're lighter in color, or that you have more features associated aesthetically with the dominant group, that your punishment is likely to be less as a statistical fact. I think that's interesting. I think the N in this research was 12,000, right? I don't think it was 12,000. It was 12,000 because I remember reading it was like 12,500 something. Huge N. It's a huge N. Anybody who does, statistical correlations, an N of 12,000 is significant. Right? So this isn't like they did a very small sample set. This was an enormous sample set. And they were able to find statistically relevant correlations using regression analysis to make sure that the variables were properly identified and there weren't extraneous external factors influencing the data. It was a consequence of skin color and skin color only why there were these disparities in sentencing, which is pretty significant finding, which is an extremely significant finding. It would be interesting to see how people would defend or challenge these findings in a contemporary sense. This research is very, very new. It was published in 2011, so I think we ought to be doing more research on really assessing the way in which the measurements were used and how the statistics were used, challenge some of the mathematics behind it, challenge some of the social implications behind it, just for good research, right? So 1B, colorism is then used to quote-unquote justify similarities or differences within a racial group, wherein those phenotypic traits resembling the aesthetical sensibilities of the dominant culture reap the benefits of such resemblance. And that's obvious, right? The idea is if you look like members of the dominant culture, if you sound like members of the dominant culture, if you think like members of the dominant culture, if you have the same religious affiliations with members of the dominant culture, you reap the advantages. And it is part of human nature as such, if there is such a thing, is human nature, as part of our mechanisms to survive and flourish, to try and adapt as much as possible, to try and assimilate as much as possible, so that we can be included within the moral community, so that we can be recognized. So people make changes. People might become religious as a consequence. It's neither here nor there. People might seek to speak well, speak better. It's neither here nor there. People might seek to have increased education. It's neither here nor there. People might seek to dye their hair color blonde. Now people are like, I don't know about that. People might start wearing contacts. But the idea is we are already doing this, right? The pressure to be Christian in America is a pressure, right? Despite the fact that we're a secular society, America is touted as a Christian nation, as paradoxical as it is, because it's separation of church and state, thus it's clearly secular. But you ask any John or Jane Doe in the street, to be Christian is, to be American is to be Christian. There is some pressure to fit into that group, into that mold, for good or for bad. There is pressure to speak like you have some sense, because when you talk like slang, you're demonstrating to people you don't know what you're talking about. Right? So that there are always social pressures. Don't think that you're going to ever be able to escape pressure. Right? To live a life devoid of pressure is not to live at all. The idea is that there is and always will be social pressures applied to everyone, black, white, Hispanic, everybody, Asian, such, Native Americans, you name it, everybody. But the idea is there is disproportionately more pressure for members of the African American community for any number of additional reasons. And the idea is you alleviate some of that pressure if you look like and you sound like, quote unquote, them. Them being members of the dominant race, whites. Number 2, quote, for an overwhelmingly male sample of black inmates in Mississippi, those assessed as having lighter skin shade by correction officers received shorter prison sentences, right? Direct quote. So, I mean, clearly, you go in, one, quote-unquote, really black guy, and one, in African-American communities, they call it red, R-E-D. It's not the color red. It's just what's said, red-boned or red. And the guy is red, he's light-skinned. Well, it's probably going to be the case that the blacker, darker person for exactly the same crime is going to do more time than a person who wasn't. I said that before. Is that right? It's absolutely not right. The question is, what are you arguing for, author? Are you arguing that we increase the amount of time in terms of punishment that we give to the person who's lighter? Or are you suggesting that we decrease the amount of time that we give to the person that's darker? I didn't get that final resolve in the reading. It could have been maybe I read it too quick and it just escaped me, but it was not clear that the author argued for either point. despite the fact that clearly the implication of this type of research argues for one of those points. I would have liked to have seen explicitly stated what the final analysis was with respect to the social application of this type of research, but I didn't get it. And then lastly, for section 1.2, quote, this is number 3, men with more stereotypically black features were more likely to receive death sentences, right? Which is pretty significant, right? We're talking about the death sentence here, but we're talking about the death sentence as corresponding to phenotypic identifiers, how an individual looks, not what the individual did. This is problematic. I would encourage those in criminal justice to rebut what was saying by the author, to defend what was saying by the author, to expound upon the findings of the author's essay, because it's a very new in terms of academia, a very new publication, 2011, which is just around the corner, and I think what we need to do is have a little bit more social discourse on the implications and the findings of that. What I wanted to do in this section, it's been a very, very long section, I'm winded. What I wanted to do in this section was demonstrate the relevance of Cornel West's account of the historical process and the 3 factors that he identified, which was scientific revolution, Cartesian emphasis on subjectivity, and the classical revival, i.e. aesthetics, and to show how these three historical processes are still functionally operative, potentially, in any number of ways, and insofar as we identify the discursive possibility of talking about race in these modes, these 3 modes of social interaction, we do a service, right? We offer the opportunity for discussion and thus hopefully alleviate the impact of racism in any one of these 3 modes of our social interaction. And hopefully I did that. So that concludes section 1.2 of my analysis into race and ethnicity in America. I'm going to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.